Well, welcome to the show. I am super excited about today's guest, Liz Bohannon. She is here, and today's episode is going to be a fun one. So you're going to hear this one on both of my podcasts, on the Business and Bubbly podcast, as well as the Meant for More podcast. So for those of you that are listening, business wise, for women in business, for community building, you're going to hear us share a little bit about God, fill in the blank for you. We're not trying to push any beliefs on you. And for those of you guys that are here on the Meant for More podcast, we are going to be diving into some really great stuff that is going to equip you. So Liz is here. She is an accomplished social entrepreneur and best-selling author. She challenges everything that you think and know about success and passion and teaches the mentalities, mindsets, and principles that will actually launch you out of waiting and into creating while building a strong community. Liz, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to connect with you.
Thanks so much, Charity. I'm so excited to be here. And I'm all about these days not wanting to be niched in myself. So, the fact that we're speaking to two different audiences at once is very on brand for me these days. So here we go.
Perfect. You and me both. You and me both. I love it. Well, Liz, I actually found you and then started geeking out on all of your stuff through like Craig Rochelle and the Leadership Summit and all of that fun stuff, and grabbed your book and started binging all of your things. And I have just been loving what you are sharing when it comes to community and when it comes to building culture and when it comes to making genuine connections that really, like, for us as human beings, we were created for connection. And I would love for you just to kind of dive into what it is that you're seeing in the world today. I know some of your background of with your shoes and with your fashion brands and working with women all over the world and in underserved countries, and how you equip them to have jobs and to, like, it has just been so inspiring to learn more about you. And so but I love what you have literally broken it down to. You're like, I'm going to go over here to make friends and to make connections with the one. And so, yeah, I would just love to hear like what your take is on community.
Yeah. So I have, as you've mentioned, for the last 15 years, have formerly been in the space of I'm an entrepreneur and building and growing companies and companies that sell products like sandals or jewelry or handbags. But when I really kind of stop and look and think about what I've been doing over the 15 years, yes, there have been sandals and there have been beautiful jewelry and handbags and apparel. But the reality is, what I think I've actually been spending my life doing is building community and
Yeah.
focusing on how do we build authentic community and connections, and how do relationships and friendships actually change the world. And for me, sandals were just kind of a means to an end. And everything really comes down to this really core belief that we were created to live in connection, and that we probably at any other moment in human history are living in a day and age, specifically here in 2024 in America, where we are really deprived and where we're living in a extreme. I have spent 15 years working in international development, so we talk about things like, the extreme poverty bracket of folks who are living in less than $2 a day. And I've had the incredible opportunity to travel the globe and to work and live and build and benefit from living in communities really all across the world. And so I think one thing that is a beautiful benefit of getting to see so much of the world, and not just like as a tourist, but like when you do business with people or you're on mission together, that's another level of kind of relationship and connection. And you understand a culture and worldviews and how people communicate and what they value in a very different way than if you're just, going on vacation. And one of the beautiful parts of that is that you start to see your own culture through a really different lens.
Yeah.
And for me, I went from going kind of just like, well, it is what it is. This is life, and we're humans and we're adults and we're all super busy and we live long distances, and it's really hard to, have a job and have kids and prioritize relationships and friendships. There's kind of this sense of when you're in your own world, I mean, it's like the frog in boiling water, right? Like you
Yeah.
don't understand when something is the air that you breathe and the water that you swim in, it can be difficult to see it for what it is. You leave that environment And then all of a sudden you go, oh, maybe this isn't like an inevitable part of being a human. Maybe this isn't how everyone is hashtag adulting. You understand that actually so much of your life and your understanding of the world and of people is actually a construct. It is the result of a specific design. And
Yeah.
every single one of us live in a culture that is actively co-creatively, like it's being designed every day. Culture isn't something that happens to us. We actually participate in culture. Some of us in very obvious ways, right? We're starting businesses, we're putting media or art out into the world that's shaping culture. Others, we're actually shaping culture by what we choose to buy, how we choose to spend our time. But no one is not participating in culture creation. So that is the first thing, is that I'm kind of over hearing people talk about like society this, culture that. And I'm like, you are talking about you. Like
Yeah.
something that's being done to you. Like we have agency and we have autonomy. And that is something that I have noticed specifically about Americans, is like we're real quick to be like they're doing this to us. And it's like
Yeah.
whatever they are putting out into the world only works if you receive it and if you buy it, if you purchase it, if you promote it, if you interact with it. And so we are all co-creating culture. That's the first thing I think to recognize and to understand. The next is our culture, regardless of where you live, is perfectly designed to get the results that it's getting. When we look at the results that we're getting right now, when it comes to mental health, relational health, and emotional health, the outcomes are very poor. That isn't an accident. That is not inevitable. That is not something that's just like, this is just part of being a human. The reality is, we are prioritizing certain values, and those priorities and those values drive certain behaviors, and those behaviors get us certain results. And the results that we are living in the midst of right now is that we are living in the midst of what the Surgeon General has called a loneliness epidemic, where the Surgeon General of the United States is saying the single biggest threat facing Americans from both a mental, emotional, and physical health perspective is the danger of loneliness and isolation. And
Yeah.
I have the really unique perspective and gift of having lived and worked and built community all over the world, where I can go, oh, hey, you guys, it doesn't have to be this way.
Yeah.
We're choosing this. We are doing this to us, which can feel like a bummer because it's really easy and it feels better to be able to point the finger at somebody. The benefit of that, of course, is that at least for me, it inspires a ton of agency and autonomy of going like, oh, okay, so if I make different choices, if I make different decisions, I can't wait for somebody else to do that for me. I can actually change the outcome. And that means I think I can change the outcome for me, probably for my family. I don't know, maybe even for my neighborhood or my school community or wherever I am. But the reality is, people are choosing different ways of living and different priorities and values. And we're seeing that the outcomes then change. And so my life has basically been an experiment, a social experiment in what if in every area of my life I choose to say, what if I orient and prioritize community and connection, change the values, change the priorities, that then change the behaviors, and then that changes the outcome.
Yeah, that's so good. So what values would you say are leading to the result of the isolation and the, like, I think especially in America we have this independent spirit, and I know for me, I've also been to other third world countries and I've served in different capacities, and it's like, gosh, things are so different in other countries, and they have villages and they have multiple generations that live together and they borrow things from each other, and it's not this closed off like, don't come onto my property and I don't have a front porch anymore. And it's these different things that they hold at higher value than what we do. They're leading them to have better community and connection than what we do in America. So I'd love to hear your insight on that and
Yeah.
what you're doing, because I know that even how you live on your fun social experiment with your neighbors and your friends, I definitely want you to dive into that, because that is something that I think is so beautiful. And I know even with me and with what we do with Business and Bubbly is we hold community and connection at the highest value. We're not meant to do life alone. We're not meant to do business alone. And so, what does it look like to, again, to be a part of that shift in culture where actually, no, I'm intentionally going to invest in a community of women that it's, we have this saying of that community isn't that you're not just in community, but community is in you, just like you are in the ocean and like you drink water and you get it on the inside of your body and that it nourishes you and sustains you. And so, yeah, I would love to hear what you think those things are that are leading to the disconnection dilemma, is what I like to call it, compared to what you see in other cultures and how you're actually living that in your everyday life.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned kind of the core root value or belief of independence, which
Yeah.
is the root of a lot of it. And listen, I'm a pretty independent person in the sense that it's like I have strong values, I have strong opinions, I do have a sense of agency and autonomy generally, that like things don't have to be the way that they are and I can be an agent of change. And none of that actually is counter to interdependence, which
Yeah.
is the belief that we were created to do life together. And so I think that we've just gotten it a bit twisted. And listen, this isn't like, it's not new, from the origins of America. Like that has been, I mean, we were literally born as a nation, as a country, as a culture, asserting our independence. Away from, a governing cultural, religious, political body. And I don't actually, I love America. And I think even our origin story of is powerful. There's also a lot of, really toxic, sad things about it, like everything.
Yeah.
The point being, I think sometimes we conflate the two. And the reality is, I think we can be creative, we can be progressive, we can be innovative, we can have agency and autonomy and have a sense of belief that we are actually better together
Yeah.
and that we need one another and that need isn't a burden, that we're not
Yeah.
burdening people when we need something, that we actually will all be healthier, better, and more fulfilled when we don't diminish our need. Like to need is to be human. And I think there's this interesting thing that has happened in culture where depending on how you're measuring it and what exact questions you're asking, anywhere from like 30 to 70% of the US population would say that they're struggling with loneliness.
Mm.
However, on average, less than 10% of people will admit it or openly talk about it. So there's a ton of shame around this idea of being lonely and being lonely simply means that you don't have the social and psychological support that you need to thrive. That's how we're defining loneliness. People are embarrassed of being lonely, but it's interesting because it's like, are you embarrassed of being thirsty? Like when you're really thirsty and you're dehydrated and you're like, I need to prioritize finding water. I don't know anybody who's like, it's just embarrassing. It's
Right.
embarrassing that I need water and that I haven't had it and that I need to prioritize going to look for it. Like people aren't embarrassed of being hungry. Like our bodies are literally designed to give us certain signals when something that we need, that we are designed. It is the way that our bodies and our minds function. And we need certain ingredients to function at max capacity. And when we dip below a healthy amount of those, our body sends us a signal. And that is what loneliness is. Like loneliness is not an accusation of unworthiness. It is not like, it's not that you are a loser. It's not that people don't like you. It's not that you can't do relationships. It's literally your body and your mind going, "Hey, you don't have the psychological and social support that you need to truly thrive. It's actually time for you to prioritize it." In the same
Yeah.
way, is get really thirsty. You're willing to go, okay, maybe this email that I need to send isn't actually, it's important, but maybe it's not the most important thing for me right now. I have to prioritize going to find water. It's obviously an extreme example.
Yeah.
But I think loneliness is the same thing. It's simply a signal. So part of what we have to do is one, just destigmatize like what loneliness
Totally.
is, what it means, what we do with it. And then I do think on a really practical level, stop glamorizing independence in the sense of if independence and doing it on your own and making it on your own and being your own person and all these things is the goal, then what that means is anything other than that is kind of less than. And so even in my community, one of the things that we've really had to intentionally do and say and talk about is we want to celebrate asking for help. Like
Yeah.
we actually hold that as a value. So when someone puts a need out into the community and asks for help, there it is met with a sense of thank you so much for asking for help. Like we acknowledge that actually it's not a burden. It really is a value. And the thing about asking for help is there's so many people that like identify as helpers, but they're these very independent helpers who are like, I love helping people. I love coming in. I love saving the day. I love being the one that can offer the favor. I never want to do that to other people
Want to
because
burden somebody.
I'm going to be a burden. What that's kind of like mixed messaging.
Yeah.
Like, I remember I have this really strong memory of being probably in like third grade and we were running the mile and I hated running the mile. I was just like, I was not an athletic kid. I was always in like the last. It brought up so much anxiety and shame for me. And so I run, who knows what it was, probably like a 13-minute mile or something. And so we get back to the classroom and everybody's like red faced and talking about how fast they ran the mile. And I remember this girl, she was like the fastest girl in our class. And I don't know, she ran like a 6-minute mile or something. And she was really hard on herself. She was like being, really, she was just like, so bummed that she was so slow and did this 6-minute mile. And I, meanwhile, being like, girl, you ran that mile in half the amount of time that I did. And then I remember her looking at me and she's like, Liz, what did you run? And I shamefully but truthfully answered whatever it was. I don't know, 12, 13-minute mile. And I remember her going, oh my God, that's really good. And I just remember being like, bullshit. Sorry, you can bleep that out. Just, you literally were just trash talking your 6-minute mile. I obviously don't believe you. Now, when you're like, oh,
Totally.
that's so nice. And I think the people that want to be the helpers, but then don't want to be a burden to others, it's like literally the same thing. Like, if you're telling me you don't want to be a burden to me, what that means is you think I'm a burden to you. And
Right.
I don't really want it. That doesn't really make me feel like I want to ask you for help
Yeah.
or come to you with my needs or my vulnerability because you're clearly operating out of a framework of burden and responsibility. And you're so scared to be a burden of somebody else. And what that puts on me is like, okay, I don't want to burden you because clearly you see this in a certain way. The people I want to be honest with, the people that I feel most comfortable asking for help with, the people that I want to be vulnerable with are the ones who are with me. Like
Yeah.
the friend that I want to call at 3 a.m. when something has gone off the rails and I really need help. I'm not gonna call the person who's just like, I just want to be a helper, but I never want to bother anybody else. Like
For
I'm
sure.
calling the person who a few months ago called me at 3 o'clock in the morning because what she did by asking me for help and by going first, she normalized it and she made it okay to ask for help. And that creates permission and grants people freedom to do the same. So
Yeah.
if you want to be a helper, if you want to be somebody that people call on for help and that people feel free to do that with, there's literally one way to do that. And that's be somebody that asks for help and go first.
Yeah, I love that. That reminds me of there's a great book by Jenny Allen called Find Your People. And she talks about how when they had just moved to this new area, and all of a sudden someone that they met at church showed up at their house unannounced. And she was like in her robe. And she's like, oh, okay, like this is the friends that we're going to be now. Okay. And she felt like a big hot mess. And that, all of a sudden it was like, oh, but actually, yeah, this is the friendships that I'm looking for and I'm longing for. And it took her to go first to show up unannounced and for me to let her in my robe, and the house is a hot mess and whatever. And now they're, really, really close friends. And I love that because I think, to echo what you're saying, like we have this whole independent spirit type of a mentality, and we really need to understand that interdependence. And it's not that I'm like needy, from a space of needy compared to, oh, I recognize the need that my soul has for connection, for deep and rich and genuine human connection, that I can show up to your house at 3 a.m. and you can show up to my house at 3 a.m. and that we're going to stick through the mess together and we're going to celebrate the great times together. And I'm not afraid to like ask you to borrow eggs, ask my neighbor to borrow eggs and vice versa. And so yeah, I just love that so much. So what have
Recognition
you,
that like anything else, culture becomes eventually with enough consistency, it becomes normal.
yeah,
I can truly say there's just things that there are just not hard for me anymore because again, and I mean, and so this works to our favor or to our disadvantage. Like something you just do it over and over again, and you just kind of are like, this is just how the world works, and this is how people work. And what I'm encouraged by is, even in my life and kind of like neighborhood community, we've been really pursuing intentional community for about a decade now, and I can just say, it's just like it becomes the air you breathe and the water that you swim in that once felt like so awkward, or I'm going to get so angsty or in my head about like, do I ask or do I not ask, or where do I owe somebody something, or do I have enough social cap? What it's just like that doesn't really exist anymore.
Yeah.
And like, who doesn't want to live in a world where the spirit is one of generosity and abundance, and like it's all going to even out? Like I was at I was at school drop off the other day, and a girlfriend was there, and she had forgotten that it was the kids had a field trip that day, and you have to pack a lunch when there's a field trip, whatever. And so I just immediately, I didn't have a call until 9 o'clock. It was like 8:30. I live really close. She works all the way across town. And so just like most natural thing in the world is like, I'm like, go to work. I'm going to go get Grayson a lunch. Like not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
And I did. And it was like the most normal interaction. But I will say, she then Venmoed me like $10 for his lunch. And I remember seeing that and just being like, that's weird. And just like, I was just kind of like, your lunch money is no good here. I get and I realize that that is also some privilege showing, right? That it's like $10 is like not going to make or break, my family. And so I don't want to diminish that, but also this spirit of going, I'm not really interested in keeping score.
Yeah.
Like I know at some point you've got, and so that like you start to realize that like something that is like very normal in culture, like your friend Venmoing you money. And I was just kind of like, what are you doing? And we're really, really close. And so close enough that I was able to be like, why did you do that? And I was, I was frazzled. I'm more offended by the fact that you sent me $10 on Venmo than if you never would have mentioned that again. That would have actually made me feel more comfortable. Like if we
Totally.
never would have spoken of that interaction because that's how normal and expected. It's like if your husband would have done the same thing and gone, no, babe, you go to work. I got the kid. Like that's the hope for these types of relationships that we're creating. And I share all of that to say it happens. Like at some point, culture shifts and new norms get created. And then
Yeah.
anything from the old world feels like, oh, that's weird.
Yeah, that's weird.
We don't do that anymore.
Yeah, I love that. So, for the listeners who aren't quite familiar with you and don't know that you have created this in the best way, like this commune, share about how you're making this normal. Because I'm a big believer that if we, and I think Ronald Reagan said this, but if you want to change the world, like start in your own home. And I love that you guys have done this starting right with your own home. And so share a little bit about what you have done.
Yeah, I mean, like every other good thing in my life, it's just started really small. It started with a group of friends, not even a group of friends. I mean, kind of we were all in our early 20s. We were living in Portland. None of us had family around. We were all kind of transplants. And so I do feel like, listen, I'm a deep believer that needs and limitation are oftentimes our greatest gifts. Like it bears it can give birth to the things that are actually good for us in the long run. And so I think for us, we were all in a new city. We didn't have family. We didn't have friends. There was just, like we were all pretty needy in the sense that we were like, we don't have any other options. And so I do think that there was a lot that contributed to like an openness. And several of us came from kind of different backgrounds where we had independently been thinking or kind of experimenting with community and relationships and friendships. But when it really came to pursuing proximity, as being kind of a key ingredient to a certain type of community. And we just started with one other couple. And we were just like, I mean, honestly, the story goes that we were living probably 10 blocks away from them. So, like, an easy walk or an easy bike ride. And their apartment next door that like shared a wall with them came open. And I can't remember, somebody said something about it. And we were like, that's really interesting. And then you have all of these thoughts that follow up of like logical thoughts of like, you already live 10 blocks away. Like, and moving is expensive and it takes a lot of work. And it's actually 10 blocks further away from work for you. So it's not really convenient. all of these things. And this is where it really does come down to like priorities. And so it's like, well, if commute to work is your top priority, you make a certain decision. If convenience is your top priority, you make a certain decision. If saving money or putting money into something else is your top priority, you're going to make a different decision. If you orient your life towards what is elevating relationships and orienting your life around relationships and community look like, it leads you to a different decision. And
Yeah.
that it led us to was to move in next door to our neighbors. And so we shared a wall. And I think for both of us, we were already in relationship with this family. What it did is it really showed us like, oh, there's a whole nother level of relationship and interaction and dependency that we have opened up that was not available to us when we even lived 10 blocks away. And I'll never forget, one of the first mornings we moved in, it was, I think, fall in Portland, or maybe it was early spring. It was cold. And I was out back and, I DIY'd everything in our apartment. We were like dirt poor. And I mean, I still love to DIY. And so it's like 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning and I'm in my backyard, like sanding something down and I'm like freezing and I'm uncomfortable. And Chris, my now neighbor, we had just moved in a couple days before, had been making coffee. And so he's making coffee and he sees me out his back window and he pours me a cup of coffee and he comes out and he brings me coffee. And he brings me this hot cup of delicious coffee. And then we chat for, a few minutes before he goes back in and continues on with his day. And I keep going on with my project. And it seems so small and so insignificant. But I remember in that moment, however, I was in my mid-20s going, oh, this moment doesn't happen unless I'm in his backyard and he sees me out in the cold on a Saturday morning. And by the way, he's already making coffee for himself. Like the cost for him to bring me a cup of coffee was so low because our lives, we were kind of living life right next to each other. And so it's like to go out of your way to bring a friend coffee at 7 o'clock in the morning when you don't live next to them, one, takes a lot of time, probably takes some forethought and some prep. Next up, you don't even know if they're home and they like want coffee because you can't like see it. There's just so much that you don't know that actually creates a higher and higher cost to just showing up and to kind of like loving one another. And again, this is a very silly, small example of proximity, but I actually don't think it's silly or small at all
Yeah.
because I think relationships and community and connection are actually just a million really small things that add up to a very big, meaningful, significant thing. And that is the other thing about relationships and connection is like it's not born in these in acts of heroism or moments or something dramatic happened and my friend showed up for me in this amazing way. Once maybe every several years or in a decade we show up for each other like that in really meaningful ways, but I think real trust and real connection is actually like these little everyday moments of like, were you there? Did you see me? Could I be honest? Did you step into it? Did we have a conflict? And then were we able to move past that and resolve that? And I think that's another thing about that's so beautiful about proximity is that it inherently increases the likelihood that you will experience conflict. The
Yeah.
further and further away we get from one another, the less and less conflict we will likely experience. Like it's just like it's like literally, I don't know, is that math? Is that geometry, right? Like the less we share, the less and less opportunity we will to have to kind of like butt into one another. I think some of the language that we use in culture now is around boundaries. Everybody loves to talk about boundaries. And listen, boundaries are great. And I'm a huge fan of the value of them. But oh my gosh, you set up so many boundaries
Yeah.
and eventually you will be in your own little conflict free like world that has so many fences and so many boundaries. And guess what? You're going to be alone
Yeah.
and might not be in conflict with people because everyone's gone because you've
Yeah.
labeled them as difficult or as toxic or as, and that like, I even just got in a little moment with somebody recently that they just like kind of threw out. I can't even remember what it was, toxic something. And I'm like, can we not? Like,
Yeah.
toxic is literally like used to, like, that's poison. And listen, there are toxic relationships. Like, if you are in a relationship and it is marked by abuse or extreme manipulation or violence, that's toxic and like boundary the heck out of yourself. Great. But like your neighbor, like saying something that kind of rubbed you the wrong way, That's not toxic. That's her being a human and it's butting up and it's kind of like rubbing up against you being a human. And you have two choices. You can come up with some story about what
Yeah,
she obviously meant and how that impacted you and how could she not even know. And by the way, it's all a story. Like you're
totally.
making all of that until you speak to the person. You have to acknowledge that is your story that you are creating and it's creative fiction. It may be real, but the likelihood is you're probably not right. And she's doing the same thing. She's
Yeah,
creating her own exact story of what happened and why it happened and who meant what. And literally the only way that you get closer to truth is if you can talk about it and you can go, "Hey, that really hurt my feelings."
yeah,
And that's super vulnerable, first of all. It's very different, by the way, to approach somebody and to say that hurt my feelings versus like what you said was wrong. What you said was rude.
yeah,
What you said was offensive. Rule number one of dealing with conflict is like stick to the I statements. Stick
yeah,
to the I statements. The moment you're telling somebody what they did and what they meant by it and what their motivation was, like you've already lost the plot, right? Because again, that's just your story of what's going on.
yeah,
But approaching somebody and going like, "Oh man, that really brought something up for me." And I would love to share it. And here's the story I'm telling myself is a phrase that I love to use because it acknowledges the reality of where you're at. It acknowledges your emotions and your narrative and why that thing did hurt you or trigger you or make you feel a certain way. So you're giving space and you're validating your own feelings while also even the phrase, "Hey, here's the story I'm telling myself," allows for there to be some co-creating, some sense of like, I'm not saying here's what happened, here's the facts of the matter. Now deal with it. It's like, here's my truth, but I'm putting that out there and I'm open to that truth and that story changing based off of like what you have to share and based off of this interaction in this kind of co-creating of the narrative that we are going to do together. And until we're willing to do that, I just think we're going to get further and further away from each other. But you do that enough in relationship. And what that actually does is just build, frankly, a rather unshakable trust in that, like, if we're brave enough and vulnerable enough and humble enough to do this with courage and humility, we're
yeah,
going to come to the other side of it. And not only will our relationship be repaired, but every time a relationship breaks and then is repaired, it is actually stronger than it was before. It's like a muscle breaking down during a workout, right? Like it actually, the fibers actually break apart. And then it is in the act of the rebuilding that the muscle actually gets stronger. And
yeah,
that is exactly how relationships work. When they break, but then they are brought back together, that is what binds us. And we are living in this moment in time where we are so afraid of the break
yeah,
and so terrified, and no one has taught us how we go back and we repair that
yeah,
as soon as something breaks, we go deeper and deeper into like, well, she's toxic. Well, I
yeah,
just have to set up a boundary. Well, she did that, and I'm just going to go further. And then it's like, okay, great. But if you do that, you're just going to end up really alone. And it's terrifying because then rupture becomes this horrifying, scary thing that we try to avoid at all costs, as opposed to rupture being something that you go, oh, this is part of life and
yeah,
this is part of relationships. And I actually have the skills and the tools that I need to repair. And then rupture, I will tell you this, becomes much less scary.
yeah,
And frankly, it happens less. Like my experience is just like you do that cycle enough and you also just grow trust and you start to have generous assumptions. And
yeah,
before you know it, even the story that you're telling yourself just gets less loud and vicious about the other person. And you just start to more naturally make generous assumptions because you've gone through this cycle over and over again. But I recently had a conflict with a friend who I live in community with. I live 8 feet away from her, and we rarely get in conflict these days. But something came up, and it really hurt my feelings. I was really tender about it, and it was still. I do have to admit, it still was scary to kind of like. It's just hard. It's awkward. Like, how do I bring this up? And I don't want to sound that intense, but it did really hurt my feelings, and so I brought it up to her and I will never forget. And we've been friends for a decade now, but she was kind of nodding. I was explaining, like, hey, I heard you say this, and this is the story that it's bringing up for me. And this is why that feels really, really tender. And I just need you to know, like, that really hurt me. And she looked at me and she was like, yeah, yeah. And she goes, will you, and I don't, I'm still even like when someone's like, I think I'm going to have to defend myself, of like, whatever. I think the next follow-up question is going to be one of like, defend how you're feeling. And instead she goes, will you tell me like everything about how that made you feel? Like,
Yeah.
just share with me, like, what did you go through? What was the story? And to me, like the trust that that creates in a relationship, like the most important thing to her in that moment was not her defending herself or being like, but you misheard me, or but I didn't really mean it that way, or but you shouldn't have been listening in, whatever it was in the first place. It was literally like the most important thing to me right now in this moment is not me or my ego or my reputation or me being an amazing, awesome person. It's that you have the opportunity to fully share how that made you feel. I want to know all of it. I can handle it. You're more important to me in this moment than my own ego or reputation. So let me have it.
So
And the trust that that creates of just going, and it was over a relatively small thing that clearly created big feelings in me, but like the trust that that creates, that it's like, okay, I don't have to be afraid of the
yeah.
conflict. um, I think that's what we all actually long for. We all actually long to know that we can bump up against each other and we can bruise one another and we can make mistakes and we can not be our best selves. And then we can come out on the other side of it, provided that we do it with humility and courage and actually have more trust, more understanding, and more love for one another.
I love that so much. And I love what you're saying about like that there is like there's this whole idea of first of all like you don't have to show up as your best self. It's funny because we actually don't say show up as your best self. We say like, show up as your favorite self. Like for me, I'm a mom and I am typically up at 3 a.m. in the breastfeeding club, not in the 5 a.m. like biohacking whatever best self club. And that's like real life. And a lot of times we feel like whether it's in the online space, like we have to show up perfectly as our best selves and all this different stuff. And there's so much information coming at us. And what you're saying about we slap a label on it. I heard this really interesting concept and it really makes sense, but it's like a lot of times we slap a label on someone because we aren't willing to process through those things or those feelings or that emotional trigger, or maybe there is like a lack of emotional maturity or whatever that looks like. We're not willing to process through that in community in a healthy way. So boom, we slap a label on it and that like draws this line and I can put my boundary up and whatever. So just to echo what you're saying, we're actually meant to process these things in community so that there's deeper understanding and we don't have to slap a whatever false label on it. And yeah, so I just love that you're highlighting that you are creating a smaller culture and community of that. And it is just it's so beautiful. I also think in today's world, the whole like only good vibes, like that whole culture, I want to like rip it down because that we can't do conflict well. And conflict is a part of life. And we are going to rub it up against each other, like what you're saying. And in the cycle of any type of relationship, whether it is a relationship that we have with a friend, a spouse, the relationships you have with your business, there is like this excitement phase. And then it's inevitable that we're going to come up against disappointment. And it matters how we steward our hearts. It matters what we do in disappointment. And if we turn towards each other and protect connection compared to if we slap a label on it and disconnect and put up walls and whatever. And all of a sudden that leads to disconnection and distrust. But if we can turn towards each other, oh man, like exactly what you're saying actually leads to deeper trust and deeper connection. So for you, what does it look like to like do conflict well? Because we all face it, we all rub up against each other, we all iron sharpens iron. Like I don't know, I'm like good vibes only, like get that out of here. Iron sharpens iron, man. Like there's gonna be sparks and there's gonna be clashes, and that is the human experience. So for you, what have you learned in handling, especially even in the business world? I think that can be okay. I like do it just like, oh, like whatever with her business and I'm in business and we don't quite have that deeper whatever relationship. Like what does it look like for you or what have you learned to be able to handle conflict well?
Yeah. So the tool of reflective listening, I think, is for me. And when I say tool, I mean I literally have a laminated worksheet that I keep. I have one that I keep on my desk. I have one that I keep in my bedside table. I have one that I keep downstairs in our kitchen. That it is literally like a 4-step process. And I'm happy to send it to you and you can, send it to your people, that can be done in literally every setting, that it's so basic, but it's actually not. And I've never met someone who naturally will do these 4 steps,
Yeah.
because conflict is so hard. It ignites so much in us. For some of us, it makes us want to run and hide. And like, I would rather die. For others, we get really flooded and we get defensive and we go to bat and we want to fight. So there's so much, like, there's such a cortisol spike that happens within us that we just can't trust ourselves. And so I think that having like a tool and a framework for doing conflict is so, so valuable.
Yeah.
Um, and I've actually developed like one. So there's like just reflective listening that you can do in like marriage counseling. That's like very relational. I've developed a version of it that I've basically kind of toned down a little bit, but really use the exact same principles for conflict within the workplace. And I refer the acronym that I use is don't shat the bed. You've got one chance to bring up a conflict for the first time. Like, don't shat the bed when you do that. And what I mean by that is SHAT, which is, first of all, kind of set the scene. So set the scene is two different things. You gotta one, wait for an appropriate time to bring up the conflict and make sure that your partner is like in a place and in a headspace where they're open to having that conversation. Nobody likes to be surprised. Nobody likes to be in the middle of something and you're like talking about one thing and all of a sudden somebody's like, well, yeah, well, the other day when and you're like, wow, you just totally co-opted that. Or like, I'm actually feeling really vulnerable and tender about something else that's happening in my personal life. I actually don't have the emotional capacity to have this conversation right now. And so, for the first thing to do, S, is you set the scene. So, one, you ask for permission. You kind of give some context for what it is that you want to talk about. Hey, yesterday, and we'll talk about it in a business setting. Hey, yesterday during that all hands meeting, there was a remark that you made that just brought up a lot for me. And I would really love to go into another thing that I really coach, especially founders or co-executives in, is using this language of having a level 1 conversation or a level 2 conversation. So level 1 is like who, what, when, where, why, just kind of like, we got to get stuff done. It's business. Level 2 is the deeper stuff. We are full humans. We have relationships and lives, and our relationships and lives are going to interact even in the business place. And so I just find it can be really helpful to just have, instead of being like, I have to talk about something kind of touchy feely, just like, hey, man, I need to have a level 2 conversation. And it's about this, something that came up for me in that all hands meeting. Would now be a good time to have that conversation? And if not, will you name a time? And this immediately, what that does is it goes from I feel bombarded, I feel surprised, I feel attacked, my defenses are up, I feel really embarrassed. I haven't even thought about that, or I don't even know what you're talking about, or I do and I feel kind of bad about it myself. And now it's like, hey, I am sharing my power. I am not using this power to manipulate you or to clobber you or to win. I'm going, hey, I have this thing and I'm inviting you in to co-creating how we're going to do with it. And so the first thing that you can do is just give somebody a sense of autonomy and permission. Like, is now a great time? You get to say yes or no. And if not now, great. You tell me when and I will circle back. So the first thing you want to do is you want to set the scene. The next thing that you want to do, this is H. So shat. H is you want to set your hopes. And I really like to be you want to start with like, what's the hope for how this conversation ends? Not like immediately going into what happened and like dissecting the past, but going, it's really important. I just would love for you to know how that comment made me feel. My hope is that I feel understood and that I feel known and that we can then move forward together with greater understanding of how we operate so that, and then this is where we get to our A, is our action step, so that we can actually make a decision about this hire. Let's say that's where the conversation gone up, so that we can get on the same page and make a decision that we both feel a lot of alignment about how we're going to go about this next hire that we're going to make together. And then T would just be some gratitude. Like, and before we even get started, thank you so much for being a partner that is willing to have these conversations and willing to dedicate time and energy to these level 2 talks. I just really appreciate it. And I really value getting to have a partner like you.
Mm.
And when you follow those 4 steps, don't shat the bed, set the expectations, declare your hopes so that you can take an action step and follow it up with thanks and some gratitude, the likelihood you are just setting the tone that it is like, I've told you what I want out of this. And what I want isn't to make you feel bad. It's not to win an argument. It's not to win some sort of point. It's not to make a point. It is literally so that we can be together so that then we can do our best work together.
Yeah.
That changes the entire course of the conversation.
That's so good. And that's what it looks like to value connection in people over being right or over getting my point across or over whatever that might, whatever might come up. And so I love that. Last question for you before we round this out, and in the spirit of just holding people at the highest value, what is it that our audience, our community, myself included, can help you with? I know you obviously as an author, I'm an author as well. So it's like sometimes it's the books or the listen to my podcast or the different things like that. But I know you have also, from what I've seen on your Instagram, which you guys go follow her, she drops these really great nuggets of wisdom and always wears some fun outfits when she's out and about speaking. But you're doing these really beautiful community trips that are contributing to just serving and mission. And so, what is it that we can help you with in this season?
Oh, what a sweet question. I'm so grateful you asked. And I'm like, oh my gosh, so much. Like, I was like, this
All
is
the things, buy the books and hire to speak and come to the things. And
basically, if I anything that I'm putting out into the world, I would love your help, your interaction, your support. So, what are a few of those things? Yes, I have my own podcast. It's called Plucking Up. I get to interview artists and authors and leaders, and we really do focus on the more challenging seasons and their mistakes and their kind of wrong turns and how they moved through them. And so, listening to the podcast, interacting, leaving reviews, that's always so helpful and
yeah.
encouraging. I am, as you mentioned, running these kind of community based trips where we're really engaging women in travel and community and friendship, but and also kind of higher causes. And so I just led a trip with International Justice Mission in to Guatemala. I'm leading a trip in February for this incredible nonprofit organization called Cure to Kenya. So in order to like know about these things, you can follow me on social media or join my email list, and you can just go to lizboho.com and join my email list. That's kind of the most reliable way to hear about these things. And then lastly, I actually even feel nervous saying this because it's so new.
Ooh,
But I just started a Substack, and it's
nice.
boho.substack.com. And I even feel a little silly. I don't know. I think sometimes you get to a certain part of your career and you're like, yeah, I've like written a book and I have a podcast and do corporate speaking, all of this stuff. And now all of a sudden, like, I mean, it's basically being like, you guys, I launched a blog. That's what it is. But I'm really excited about curating a space that is uncurated. I think even in my different channels, I do feel some sense of like, I have to be this in this space, or this is really the focus of this space. And my hope for my Substack, which I'm calling the Boho Beat, is that it really is just kind of my unfiltered thoughts on like life and love and relationship and parenting and being a human in the world. Kind of going back to the beginning of this conversation where I'm refusing to niche in and I'm really leaning into that. And so if you go to lizboho.substack.com and sign up and say hi, I will actually like, it's so new. I have like 2 posts. Like I'll
I
know
love
that
it.
you signed up and I'll see that you said hi and it'll really encourage me. So I would love for you to join me over there as well.
So good. Well, we will make sure to have all the things and all the show notes and to share it out. But Liz, thank you so much for your time and for what you're doing. I love it. I'm on a similar mission with you and shifting culture to hold community and connection at the highest value. Like, mark my word, I think even in the next few years with AI and all the things, and we're not going to know if that's a robot talking to me on Instagram, that I think that people are going to be awakened to how valuable heart to heart, human to human, genuine connection, healthy connection really is. And I just love the message that you're sharing and what you're creating on a family level, on a how you're working with companies and corporations on doing this. So just know that I'm in the journey with you, and I'm really grateful that you carry that on your heart as well. So thanks for being here.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me into this beautiful community that you've created.
Thank you so much for listening to the show. I hope it brought some value and some fun into your business and life. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast, and even share the episode with a fellow business bestie who you know will love it. It helps us continue to attract top-level guests and reach more and more women who are on their journey in business just like you. Remember that when money gets in the hands of good women, great things happen. Cheers to your success.